You are listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and I am joined again by Cathy Loerzel to talk about soul ties, what they are, how they are formed, and we are also going to address how to break curses, agreements, vows, and soul ties. This is the final episode of Season 3. I will be taking a month off to prepare more content. Season 4 will release to the app on April 13th. Remember, if you want to get episodes as soon as they are released, you need to download the Place We Find Ourselves app and pay $3 a month or $30 per year, and then you will get the episodes as soon as they are released. All episodes become free 4 weeks after they release to the app. Thank you so much for listening to Season 3, and this is the final episode. Okay, I'm back with Cathy Loerzel. Cathy, good to see you.
Good to see you too. Hi, everybody.
I'm going to just summarize last episode about curses, agreements, and vows, and then we're going to move into this whole arena of soul ties. So first, kind of a summary. A curse it comes from a person who names you in a way that harms and destroys, such as, you're so dramatic, why do you always have to be so sensitive? That's a curse. An agreement is where you come to own the curse as true of your own heart. So something in you joins with, I'm too dramatic, I am too sensitive. And then a vow is when you declare a way to protect your heart from that sort of harm again. And so a vow might be, I will toughen up, harden my heart so that I'm not so sensitive, so that I might get the blessing of my mother or father or whoever cursed me. With that as kind of introduction or summary, rather, anything you'd add, Cathy, or should we just move into soul ties?
No, I think soul ties, I don't know how you're feeling about talking about soul ties, but they're always the more complex of the four because it's personal to a relationship. So yeah, I think we can jump right in if you want.
When you use that term soul tie, what do you mean? What is it?
A soul tie is where your soul has come to find rest in someone who means you harm. And it's where you've connected your soul or submitted your soul to loyalty to someone else's that is not actually based on mutuality and goodness and respect.
Even before we get into that level of specificity, maybe it's helpful just to say that human beings are created with certain capacities by God. And one of the capacities that we have is the capacity to bond. We can bond with other people in healthy and unhealthy ways. That is a capacity that God has given to human beings. And so in Ephesians 4, Paul says, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. And that word unity is the same word that Jesus uses when he says a man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife. So we're talking about a knitting together, and we have that capacity to form deep, intimate relationships and connections. The premise of soul ties is that can be used for good or for ill. We can form holy bonds and unholy bonds. Oftentimes, Cathy, I think a soul tie is the result of triangulation. Does that resonate?
I think of it in two categories. One is triangulation, and the other one is arousal structures.
How does a soul tie result from triangulation? And then we'll talk about arousal structures.
Soul ties really at the base of them, they're an emotional connection or tie that's based on loyalty, like a false loyalty, shame, rage, or violence. All of those things. And as you said, we are meant to create connection and ties with one another. That's even the idea of covenant. God makes covenants with us. He made covenants with the Israelites. This is a rich, sweet place that God has embedded in our souls to be able to connect to one another. Now, good connection should always be based on mutuality, on love, on respect, and freedom.
Yes.
What happens with the soul tie is that you're put in a position where you must choose them over some sense of your own goodness, the goodness of others, or health and relationships. So how this plays out in triangulation in terms of family of origin is that oftentimes one child is picked by a parent over the other children. And just that alone, that mom or dad is asking that child to be more loyal to them than they are to their siblings, to the other spouse, to the family structure, in order for them to commune together in a way that creates a false and unhealthy bond between the two.
In my family, my mother and I had a deep emotional connection that she instilled and nurtured in me from the time I was very small, out of the womb. And over time, that developed a dynamic in our family where everyone knew I was really close to mom. And it set me up to be envied by my father. So that's the core of triangulation. How might a soul tie come to be operative in that environment?
So soul ties, it can be confusing because I think there can be something of loyalty. Like, let's say, I would use your story, but maybe let's use a more generic story. Where a son is required by his mother to comfort her. Mm-hmm. And that's part of their interplay. I will take care of you and favor you, but in return, I need you to comfort me and show me that I am a good mother. And so this child has some sense of this is what's required of me in order to get love, in order to get protection. And that establishes a soul tie over time in the sense of now I am needing to give something that isn't necessarily healthy or for my own well-being in order to receive something from a primary caregiver that should be given freely. No mother should require of their son to comfort them in order for them to feel connected and loved in the mother-child relationship.
And this is where, with this example, I think of what you said earlier when you were first introducing this, where your soul has come to find rest in someone who provides goodness mixed with great harm.
Yes. Yeah. And soul tie can feel like love.
Yes.
And it's very close to love. Again, the way a child is meant to bond and attach to its mother is one of the purest, most beautiful things that we are automatically created for. But when that mother starts to require something that isn't meant to be required of a young child, like very often when you find a mother who is insecure, who hasn't received love, who's come from an abusive background, all of a sudden they have a child, and now they're looking at this child going, wow, this baby will love me the way I've never been loved before. And I'll fulfill my worth as a person by the love of this sweet baby. And so this mother then kind of weaves her soul and his soul together over time, but it's not actually for his flourishing and goodness. It's more to fulfill something in her heart that was missing. And so this child is then relegated to needing to attune more fully to his mother than he's meant to. She needs him to be able to tell when she comes home and she's angry and she needs comfort. He's waiting and to anticipate her needs. And that can happen in something that feels almost sweet. I think that's what gets so confusing. Often I'll work with people in groups. They're like, yeah, but my mom gave me the greatest love. And my dad was incredibly abusive. And here was my mom, and we were in it together. And she protected me from my dad. I protected her from my dad. And it was the two of us against the world. That's more common than you would think. But what happens in that is that that's not actually for your good and your freedom. Something of your soul has been required to merge with the other person and not be separated in order for you to give and receive love. That's not love.
And so there is a profound limiting of your individuality and your freedom to be whatever kind of boy or girl you are becoming.
That's right. Without fear of punishment or withdrawal. And so often when you step into those stories with people, you start to uncover the places where they started to play around with how free can they be? how differentiated are they allowed to be without losing mom? And so they'll have one or two of those stories where they tried to not play by the rule book that they intuitively knew. And more likely than not, there were massive consequences that the child then realized, oh no, this isn't worth it. This isn't worth it. I'm going to go back to the way I know I'm meant to be in this home in order for there to be calm, in order for there to be harmony, even if it's difficult and feels a little dark or restrictive, it's better than the alternative. And that's when your soul really merges with someone else's soul. And that's more on the kind of, I'll say, the loving spectrum, right? Because most of those people will come back and say, gosh, but she really loved me. We loved each other. Well, now you're dealing with a loyalty structure where for them to give up their mother in terms of their loyalty to her is also going to mean to tend and deal with a soul tie, and where that mother really worked very hard over a long period of time to really enmesh the soul of this child with her own. Now there's the other side of it. That's the violent soul tie. And that's a different category.
Can you flesh that out?
Let's say you come in with a story around an incredibly violent father, and you were the one that his violence came out after more than anyone else in the family. So you're coming into a session, and the narrative you're telling is how horrible your father is and that he was an abusive man. Everyone can get around that and say, gosh, I'm so sorry you suffered that. This is horrible. What a violent, horrible man. What they're not getting to in saying all of that is the sense of how your soul was also merged with his, in the sense of how his violence activated something in you. And then there was an interplay between both his violence and then the elevation of something in your own heart that brought life, that brought terror, that brought a sense of fight, or brought you down a notch and you cowered in the corner. Like all that, no matter what, all of that can be a tie to that person because something of your personhood has now been connected to their personhood and how they wanted harm for you over time.
So very often, soul ties are the consequence of what we could say are ritualized ways of relating to someone. And that ritualized way can be violent. And in that violence, there is a connection. And this is a good place to transition to arousal structures. Violence is arousing. And I don't mean that sexually necessarily. I mean, it heightens cortisol levels and other neurochemicals that make us feel a sense of aliveness and awareness in the midst of the violence, particularly when it's with an attachment figure, when there's so much at stake. So when you say arousal structures, Cathy, what are you talking about?
We're all meant for arousal. Our bodies are meant for it. We have a lovely concoction of chemicals in our body that are just waiting to be used in order to bring our bodies more online. The reptilic function of our brain is directly connected to a lot of these chemicals. So it's the part of us that is the most basic part of our existence is connected to arousal. And arousal is used to let us know this is something good is coming, or a sense of something very bad is coming. And it can be anywhere on that spectrum, arousal can be. And so I think when you start to look at arousal structures, it's, do you understand the thing that brings your body online or activated, and something that you have to join? Like your body gets hijacked by the moment. So I tell kind of a silly arousal structure story, but every morning on my way to work, around 5th and Mercer, which if you know Seattle, you know where that is, I get on my phone and I order Starbucks. So it's waiting for me when I round the corner and I get to the Starbucks that's right next to the building at the Seattle school. And my body starts to anticipate it. I know something good is coming and I'm excited. It's a moment of pleasure. It's a moment of anticipation and goodness, and I love it. It makes me feel better. It gives me something of a high, as I'm about to go into work. And my triple Americano is waiting there for me on the counter. That's the baseline of kind of arousal. That's an arousal structure. So I know when I'm, anticipating getting onto 5th and Mercer, that this thing is coming and my body starts to come alongside. And the way that it completes itself is by me getting the coffee, stepping in my office, sitting there drinking my coffee, and then reading my emails for the morning. And that completes my arousal cycle. And so we all have arousal cycles that get us to the peak of the arousal and then the drop off, right? The place of rest that happens after the peak of the arousal happens. Now that happens with lots of different things. That can be sexual arousal. That can be violent arousal. The idea that you could anticipate when your father would come home and he would be angry. You knew the signs and you watched that happen over time. And you knew when he was coming in the door, you could tell, was it going to be a good day or a bad day? Well, you're already heightened and you're waiting to hear something from him and notice something so that you know how to respond. If it was a bad day, you also knew that it was going to be up to you to absorb his violence for the rest of the family. So he would get angry, he would notice, and then his outburst with you would happen, which was very ritualized. You knew what it was going to be about, probably about a toy that was left out or something that you had done. And then he would feel better. You would know that it was over and the whole family would rest. The whole family, because they knew that you guys had just completed your violent arousal structure as a family and you had gotten out of it. And now you knew the rest of the night would be fine. It's a very important category for us to understand because so many of these aspects, whether it's a curse, a vow, an agreement, a soul tie, are deeply rooted in our stories, deeply rooted in what happened to us and what has trained us and conditioned us to respond to the world the way that we do.
And what I hope you're hearing is that there is a deep linkage between the physical, namely our bodily chemicals, and the spiritual realm when it comes to soul ties. Soul ties, I would say, exist ultimately in the spiritual realm, but they play out in the most physical of substances, namely the chemicals in our body. And so when you talk about an arousal structure, Cathy, how does that often develop into a soul tie?
I think soul ties are so often connected to how we perceive the world being and how we perceive ourselves and the world needing to be in order to deal with it. So soul ties have a lot of power because now all of a sudden you are in cahoots with someone else in your world around how things are going to play out. Let me say that in the context of you're the recipient of your dad's rage. You would say, I hate my dad. He was violent and abusive and horrible. You would never think you have a soul tie with him. But when you start to dig deeper, there was an agreement between the two of you that transcended onto a spiritual level where you knew what was required of you. He knew what was required of you and the place that you held in the family, and you satiated him.
And it's not your fault, but there was an agreement.
Yes. It's my role in the family to satiate my father's violence.
And at some level, frankly, and this is getting into just such deep, dark waters, but at some level, you found power in that.
Yeah. Yes. Sometimes that's years of story work to get to that place where you understand how it served you. And when you realize why you held on to it in that family, the only way you all stayed safe was if you absorbed your father's violence. And so there's some sense of saying, gosh, brilliant.
Well done.
Well done. And now it's time for you to understand what it's cost you, because chances are you now have violent arousal structures playing out in your current life and in your current relationships. And that may be the place where you find the most rest. So like for me, I have violent structures, arousal structures embedded in my story. And every time I come back from a certificate weekend or come back from facilitating, I've been gone from my family for 4 to 5 days. I've been absent. I've been occupied with other people's stories. I'm feeling secondary trauma because of the stories I've been working with. I'm exhausted. Whether I want to or not, I pick a fight with my husband. I come home and I notice, even if he did everything in the house that he knew I would want done, I will find the one thing that was not done. And then it's like the toilet. And I'm like, 4 boys in a home together with this stupid toy, like, and I literally, I'll be like in a skirt and heels scrubbing the toilet, being furious because my husband didn't actually, get everything done that he needed to get done as he was taking care of my children while I was off working. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it happens. And then he says that, how in the world are you mad at me right now? And I'm like, well, I just don't understand why you don't see this stuff. And we'll go into a spiral and we'll get angry, and then we'll hit the peak, we'll resolve, and I feel relief. I actually feel like I can settle back into the home in a way that I couldn't without something of relief in me, having gotten into kind of a fight and duking it out a little bit. Well, that's how I've come to find rest. And so I have to work on that. My husband and I have had lots of conversations, and we're way better now than we were 7 years ago. But it's still something that's in me that I need to be aware of. And the way I've become aware of it is knowing where those origin stories are that train me to need that sort of arousal and violence in order for me to feel soothed. So it's not easy, and sometimes it's not clear. But I think when you do step further and further into your story, you start to see where these things start to appear. And at the Allender Center, we don't, like, if I was telling a story about my dad and how he would get angry when he got home from work, we wouldn't immediately step into my soul tie with my dad. That's after months and years of understanding the pattern, what it did for me, what it did to me, the place I held in my family, the other stories, where there was triangulation, where there is loyalty, all those things are fully vetted so that before I step into actually breaking a soul tie, you have to understand where it came from, why it's there, and how it served you. Or else when you break it, it's just not going to have as much power because you haven't actually dealt with the hard internal work and healing that you need in order to keep it broken.
Yeah, soul ties are a 400 level kind of college course if we're looking at the course of warfare, and curses, agreements, and vows are like a 300 level course. And so this is more advanced stuff, but it has to become a category for you, because unless your parents had a healthy marriage where the marital bond was the strongest bond in the family unit, it is almost guaranteed that there is triangulation in your family, and therefore that there are soul ties at play in your family. And if you were not the chosen one, if you were not either chosen for an unhealthy intimacy, or if you were not chosen to be the recipient of violence, then chances are you found someone outside your family who gave you the life and the delight and the attachment and the connection that your heart was desperately longing for because you weren't chosen in your family. And now you've got a soul tie with your coach or with your piano instructor. And so it is so important to put language to the nature of the dynamics of your family of origin so that you can have clues as to where your heart might be bound to another human being who does not wish you well.
Yes. And that may look like you feeling like you can never not go home for Thanksgiving.
Okay, so great. So you're transitioning now. Let's talk about some of the signs that I might have a soul tie with someone. Frankly, there are a lot of them, but you just named one. Can you say it again, Cathy?
Yeah, I mean, the idea that you don't have autonomy and freedom to make good choices on your own behalf without bearing great cost on behalf of your family. So let's say you decide you're not going to go home for Thanksgiving this year, and you've gone home every other year for your entire life. What happens? There could be grief and a sense of, oh my gosh, we're going to miss you. Oh gosh, that's fine. That's not necessarily an indicator of a soul tie. Now, what happens if your mom is like, well, your wife is the one who's keeping you from us. You would have never not come home until you married Sally. How could you do this to me, Johnny? You know that if I'm left alone with your father, then who knows how he's going to be when he drinks too much on Thanksgiving. Sometimes those words are spoken. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes a mom could just go, fine.
Right.
Fine. And then they give you a silent treatment for 3 months until you come crawling back and repair.
These are the symptoms of soul ties. I can't tell you how often in my office I'm talking with a client and I'll suggest something like, with regard to relationship with a parent, what if you just didn't write a Mother's Day card this year? Because they're struggling now that they've begun to engage some of their relationship with their mom. They're like, I don't know what to say in a Mother's Day card. And I'll ask the question, what if you didn't write a card this year? And the look on their face, and they will respond with something along the lines of, you don't understand, Adam. That's not an option.
Yeah. So wherever there's fear and that feeling of the only option is if I play my part, that's when you're in the realm of a soul tie. And that you know the consequences are going to be dire. It feels like life and death. That means that person has a hold over you that is not love. That is not love. That's being bound to something and a dark loyalty that is not ultimately our loyalty to God. That is a loyalty to another human being that has been perverted into something that it's not meant to be.
Another symptom of a soul tie is, do you find yourself having conversations with people who aren't in the room? I mean, do you find yourself having a conversation with your father when he's not there? Or with your mother when she's not there? There are poles in the world. And one of the indications of an unhealthy linkage, an unhealthy bondage, an unhealthy pole is you just find yourself arguing perhaps your point or having conversations with people who aren't in the room. When you are working so hard to make a relationship work, that's often an indication of a soul tie. And we're not going to get into it today, but soul ties can happen with friends, with bosses, with coworkers, with people that you are doing creative endeavors with. Soul ties can happen with people other than attachment figures, other than parents. But the common denominator is the same. It is a lack of freedom to be yourself, so that you might somehow preserve the connection, the relationship, the friendship.
I think of the idea of when you have to cover for them, protect them, or make them something other than who they actually are. So where you're participating and even deceiving yourself and the world, then there's something of a false loyalty that's obligating you to not tell the truth. If you don't want to go home for Thanksgiving, that can be grieved, again, but it should be okay. There is no relationship where we're so bound to it that it means that we have to deny ourselves or deny something of our own humanity or our freedom in order to maintain that connection. Oftentimes we look at codependency as something that's a rich place for you to think about soul ties. So if you're a self-diagnosed, codependent, that's a place where you can look at some of those stories and understand, how did you get there? And chances are somewhere in your origin stories, there's someone who taught you how to be hypervigilant on their behalf in order to make sure that your world was going to work the way that it needed to and that there was safety and protection.
Before we end, we need to talk at least a bit about, okay, I start to see some of these curses, agreements, vows, soul ties at play in my life, in my story. How do I go about getting free? How do I go about breaking these things?
It's a great question. I want to start with the fact that we have the power in Jesus to break all of these things. There is nothing that we haven't been given the mantle of authority in order to contend with. And it isn't magic. It's not a sense of you have to speak the right words, in the right sequencing in order for you to break, a curse, a vow, a soul tie. But I would say to the degree that you can get onto the ground of where it originated will be to the degree that emotionally it's successful. I believe that you can break a vow in the spiritual realm with great success. You could go into any vow right now that you've started to identify through these podcasts and break it in the name of Jesus. However, if you don't understand how it came to be and how it served you, then it can come back really quickly as soon as you need it again.
What I'm hearing you say is there has to be an emotional engagement via your limbic system with the particular stories in where you were either cursed or made agreement or made a vow. And it doesn't have to be the first time you are cursed, but it has to be a story when these things became operative. And for you to emotionally connect to that boy or girl in that story, I think is prerequisite to really breaking these things. So point number one is particularity and emotional closeness to the story. Point number two is there has to be a posture of kindness towards the boy or the girl who was cursed, who made agreements, who made vows. If there is demand or contempt, if there's anger, no, not going to be effective. There has to be kindness and a posture of understanding how, frankly, you were seduced or duped, and that inevitably involves grief. Inevitably.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think if you even go back to the you, before you deal with vows, curses, agreements, typically we move people into a place of being able to dip down into that deep grief of recognizing what's been true about your story and how you have really suffered. If you can do that, you're going to have so much compassion for the little girl who was relegated to her room and decided that being dramatic was too costly and she needed to pull it together. If you're approaching your vows from a place, like you said, of demand, frankly, I mean, they're going to fight against you, because the reality is if you're still going at them that way, there's still something of you that needs to be the tough girl that hasn't been healed yet. So now you're just replacing that vow with the vow of doing the right thing and, being a good Christian and getting rid of all these pesky vows. Well, that's just another vow. It's not actually healing. By the time you get to breaking a vow or curse, agreement, or soul tie, it's almost like the icing on the cake.
Yeah.
It's like the very last thing for us that we do. For us, we've just found it so much more helpful when it's just kind of the last thing that we do to kind of clear it all out, because emotionally it's already been healed. It's already been dealt with. You're understanding why it was there. And now when you get into the room and say, I break this vow of always needing to be a tough girl and never being allowed to need something that other people can give me. I break it in the name of Jesus to be sent to the pit of hell, and I ask in its return there to be tenderness and mutuality and goodness, and that I may receive care from others. Boom, you've just broken a vow.
Point number one was particularity, story, getting close to it. Point number two, kindness. I guess point number 0 that you shared was that you have authority in Jesus to use your words and your will to break any of these things. And so when someone wants to break a soul tie, Cathy, how would I go about doing that in terms of the final step? I mean, you've taken us through the necessity of grief. You've taken us through, as brief as this has been, nevertheless, kind of a cursory understanding of the emotional work that needs to be done. But then what's the final step?
The final step is really just speaking into the spiritual realm and breaking the tie. So it would be, I break the tie that's between me and my dad. I break any power that tie has over me, any power that tie has over my family and the generations. And I break that in the name of Jesus, not to be reconnected again. And I place my Father at the foot of the cross. He is no longer mine, and I'm no longer bound to him or any spiritual warfare that has come to me through him.
It is a kind thing to do for the other person. What you're saying is, I allow only the love of God and only the presence of the Spirit of God between the two of us.
Yes.
This is not rejecting them. This is not cursing them. This is not judging them in a sense of condemnation. This is saying, may there be only between the two of us, my body, my spirit, their spirit. May there only be the love of God and the Spirit of God. I'm giving you, God, this person. I'm giving them back to you. And I'm severing this tie that exists between our two hearts because of how our stories have evolved over the years.
That's right. Yeah. And it's really important to also then send back their warfare. Because what's true about soul ties, I think, is that when you have a soul tie with someone, you also have a direct line from their spiritual warfare. It has a direct line into your heart too. And so to send their spiritual warfare back to them and out of you and really close that portal. Part of what happens in a soul tie is that we do have a false sense like it's up to us to protect them.
Yes.
And that it is a rejection. It is kind of leaving them to have to tend to themselves. I mean, as I've broken soul ties with people over the years, there has been this sense of, if I break this with my father, he will die, or he will no longer be protected. Like, who will love him now? I think that's a threat from evil to keep us bound to unhealthy relationships. And again, it doesn't mean that now you're not allowed to see your father ever again. On the contrary, if there's still hope and redemption and it's not toxic, then you may be able to have a sweeter, more true, good relationship with your father, because it's no longer your responsibility to keep him alive or keep him sound or safe or feeling loved. You know, you're releasing him and you from a false sense of loyalty and a false power that isn't actually yours to hold.
Cathy, thank you. These are very difficult and complex, at some level, complex waters to wade into, at least from the perspective of a podcast, because we don't have a real person and a real story in front of us. And so we're trying to talk about it kind of generically. And I think you did a fantastic job of taking something very real and making it particular rather than abstract, even though you've kind of had to be talking about it generically and generally. Again, listeners, if you want more on this subject, I recommend considering the certificate program at the Allender Center. Either the certificate program or the story workshop, both of these places will go into these categories in more depth, both in the teaching time, but far more importantly, in the context of your own story.
Yeah, we would love to see you there. And those programs are how I learned this.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to the final episode of Season 3. Remember that I will be taking a month off to prepare more episodes. Season 4 will release to the app on April 13th. If you want to get episodes as soon as they are released, you need to download the Place We Find Ourselves app and pay the $3 a month to subscribe and get new episodes as soon as they are released. All episodes become free 4 weeks after they release to the app. Have a good week.